Hello, everyone. I'm just going to briefly finish this slideshow that we started in class last Friday, and just also reiterate a little bit about what's on the quiz on Friday. It will be a short quiz, expect like 15, 20 minutes tops. It will have a few questions about why nations fail, and then also some questions about geography that really come from your map. So this information that's in this slideshow is just some additional context for you so we can dig into some of the, application of some of the geography, where things can, connect to some of the history that we're going to be looking at. We did in class look at a few maps, and we ended up at this map, which is the physical map of South America. And, we noted a few things. There are a few countries that are not Spanish speaking in South America. First and foremost, Brazil, which was established by the Portuguese. So to this day, Brazil's language is Portuguese. We also have Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana. Those are countries that generally are not Spanish speaking, either English or perhaps Dutch to some extent, and then French. The rest of the countries are generally Spanish speaking, although, as noted in class, there's a lot of other languages. It's a diverse, especially cities are cosmopolitan and diverse. There's a lot of indigenous populations in particular areas, so you might have, some of the language of the Inca, for example, was Quechua. Nahua for the Aztecs, some of those languages are still available. Somebody asked on their index card, why is it that Guatemala has such a high percentage of indigenous persons? And some of that is because, Guatemala was once very attached to modern day Mexico. They eventually split, but this was the viceroyalty of New Spain, and this was the area where the Aztecs and the Mayan people were. So where modern day Guatemala is, you have most of the Mayan indigenous groups, and there's more than 20 different groups that speak Mayan languages. And so you have multiple people who have that particular ethnic background in Guatemala. And I want to say, because I think I said in class that it was about 80% of the population, probably about half of the population that identify as clearly indigenous. And then, like Mexico, there's a large mestizo population. So people that may have indigenous identity, whether or not people identify, legally as indigenous. And just like a lot of societies, sometimes the political rights or the social conditions are not necessarily the same for people who are in indigenous, ethnic groups. And so just like we track in the United States, lots of times data based on, race or ethnicity, social class, all kinds of things like that. We get some challenging statistics in a space like Guatemala, where, healthcare, for example, tends to be less available for indigenous populations than the non-indigenous populations. But in any case, really big takeaways, I think, from this map, is some of the physical landmarks, notably the Andes Mountain, also some of the highlands in the area of Brazil, and then north in Venezuela. You also, can see the Pampas, so, places that were referred to in Why Nations Fail. Patagonia, so lots of desert areas. And just like, South America is interestingly very east compared to North America, the southernmost point of South America, is very close to the Antarctic. So you have, very, very interesting kind of change in climate as you continue to go south in South America. Okay. So this just gives us a little bit of a picture of Central America. Panama being the southernmost country in Central America. And then you also have, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and so on, El Salvador. So these countries really comprise Central America. very much part of New Spain at the time that Why Nations Fail was using their example. But you can also see the Greater Antilles and the Lesser Antilles. And somebody noted that it feels like the Greater Antilles are very horizontally laid out, and that does seem to be the case. Whereas, we kind of get the Lesser Antilles being very much like a vertical layout with many small islands. And of course, some of the islands very, very close to South America. So very, very big, distinction, for example, between an island like Antigua and an island like Trinidad in terms of where they're located. And another question that popped up on an index card was, are these cultures are very similar because they're so close in space and maybe even in size. And I think it's a really good question. In a lot of cases, we do see very, very different culture, sometimes because the earlier influences are very, very different. And even throughout some of the societies themselves, you could take a space like geographically, Haiti and Dominican Republic share an island, but culturally, there's a great deal of difference, and politically, there's a great deal of difference, and a lot of ways to analyze kind of the, how and why that happened. And a lot of it has to do with the various pattern of colonization, also with Cuba, where you may have various groups of people, it's a very diverse population, but within Cuba, there's kind of like an awareness of some of that diversity. So this is the racial makeup of Latin America, and this is kind of an estimate. Let's say that this is broad. It changes, and it is something that we could look at in a lot with some better statistics. So I'm just kind of showcasing this because it gives us the whole of Mexico all the way through South America, and it gives us a sense of the diversity of Latin America. You can see, for example, where you might have modern day Argentina. You have people who are identifying predominantly as European. So we had lots of migration to modern day European, intentionally migration from Europe. That might include, for example, Italian immigrants. You also have areas which are predominantly Native American or indigenous. You can see that in the red. So we could see like, Guatemala might be a space, but also, other areas along the area where we're looking at, Central America, lots of Mexico, for example, where we might see predominantly Native American. Also, areas along the western coast, so where we might see, Andes populations, especially on the eastern side of the Andes Mountains. We also see into modern day Colombia, Venezuela, a great deal of mestizo or indigenous populations. We also have large scale African Americans in South America, and also in areas of the Caribbean, and where that population tends to be. We see especially in modern day Brazil, and some of that is related to the colonization of the Portuguese and the dominance of some of the sugar plantations and some of the advent. Brazil is the location in South America where we really see slavery go the longest, even longer than the United States. The United States ends slavery around, 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Maybe you could argue, a little bit before that with some of the efforts of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union Army and so on. But it's not really until the 13th Amendment that slavery is constitutionally prohibited. That's going to be much later in the country of Brazil, before 1900, but much later into the 1880s. And we also can just see the really extensive mixed population. In the case of Brazil in particular, we see large scale mixing of populations. So sometimes you'll see the word pardo, or you might see the word mestizo. These are, various mixes of European and indigenous, or European and African, perhaps indigenous African and European. And so some of that distinction is very much part of the social class of Latin America, something that we'll talk a lot about when we get to look at the independence movements, because in a lot of cases, the social standing of, say, political leaders who are Creole, or political leaders who are Peninsulares, or people who are moving into their particular economic or social class, in a lot of cases. Race is a part of that. This gives us an image of the Spanish conquest. So this takes us back into the 1500s. And, just so you have a little bit of an idea how the Spanish operated, generally this was a colonial structure that was very tied to the central government in Spain. There were viceroyalties. So here we can see the viceroyalty of Peru, for example. You also see the audiencias. So the audiencias are set up in particular cities. The viceroyalty is kind of like the central government of Spain sets up its shop. So this is kind of like the royal government of Spain, led by Peninsulares, and then people who are living in the Americas who are Peninsulares. You may have some small participation by people who are born in the Americas and have Spanish or European bloodlines, but for the most part, we're seeing this really tie to the government in Spain. And then the audiencias kind of is created as an opportunity for local people to express their concerns and issues to the Spanish government. So there is kind of a space for people to highlight some of their concerns. But you can see the Viceroyalty of New Spain all the way up by Mexico, and the Viceroyalty of Peru. Those are the first two in the 1500s. If we were looking at, the conquests, we would see Francisco Pizarro kind of in the area of Cajamarca here. This is the kind of area of the targeted attack on the Inca, and that follows Cortez in the Aztec area, which is in the north in Mexico. One last map, and this is just the last map, we'll just note this in terms of some of the colonial system. By 1800, which is a little bit more the map, what it looks like at the time of some of the the independence movements, so look at some of the Latin American independence movements as very connected to European Enlightenment and the American Revolution, so 1776, and also the Haitian Revolution, right? So the 1780s and so on into the 1790s and 1800. The things that we're seeing on this map, you can note 4 different viceroyalties. By 1800, there's a great deal of break up to try to manage the space a little bit better. So all of Mexico and most of, Central America, and really, kind of a good part of North America is attached to the Viceroyalty of New Spain. I'll point out the city of Dolores, which is the Mexican Revolution begins with Father Hidalgo, who has a cry from Dolores. It's a place, and that's where that begins. But the Viceroyalty of New Spain, we also have the Viceroyalty of New Granada. New Granada is going to be where we would have modern day Ecuador and Colombia and Venezuela. We also have the Viceroyalty of Peru. So we have what was once a much larger Viceroyalty of Peru, but we also have the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. This is going to be the space where Buenos Aires becomes a really significant city. And we're looking at the Viceroyalty that is like basically modern day Argentina. You can also see the Viceroyalty of Brazil. For a long time, Rio de Janeiro is not the capital of Brazil. Essentially changes over time. We'll get into Brazil a little bit more specifically. It has a bloodless revolution, but look at this yellow kind of Viceroyalty of Brazil as being very attached to Portugal. And you can see, Venezuela in the north, Dutch Guyana, modern day Suriname, and French Guiana. So you have a French colony here as well. To this day, that land is part of France. There's also the islands, for the most part, are Spanish colonies. The exception would be the island of Jamaica, which for the most part exists as a British colony. Okay, be well. If you look on the right, you'll see some of the changes. This speaks to after independence, which is exactly where we're headed.